Jasmine had been asleep for maybe 2 hours when the pounding started. At first, she thought she was dreaming. Heavy fists hammering against wood, muffled shouting from somewhere far away. But then her eyes snapped open and she realized the noise was real. Someone was beating on her front door like they were trying to break through it. She grabbed her phone from the nightstand. 2:17 in the morning. Her heart was already racing as she swung her legs out of bed. She'd been an FBI agent for 6 years, trained for high-pressure situations, but nothing quite prepares you for chaos erupting in your own home in the middle of the night. "Open up." "Joy Security!" The voice was loud, aggressive, definitely male. Jasmine pulled on her robe and started toward her bedroom door. But before she could even reach it, she heard something that made her blood run cold. The sound of wood splintering. They weren't just knocking anymore. They were breaking in. "Wait! I'm coming," she shouted, but it was too late. Her front door exploded inward with a crack that echoed through the apartment. 3 men in security uniforms burst through, flashlights cutting through the darkness like searchlights. Jasmine froze in her bedroom doorway, hands instinctively going up. Years of training kicked in, even though every part of this situation felt wrong. "Get on the ground, now." The lead officer was a white man, maybe 40, with the kind of build that said he spent too much time at the gym. His hand rested on the weapon at his hip, not drawing it but making sure she saw it was there. "I live here," Jasmine said, keeping her voice as steady as she could manage. "This is my home." "What's going on?" "On the ground." "Don't make me tell you again." She complied, lowering herself to her knees and then to her stomach on her own living room floor. The carpet pressed against her cheek. She could see her broken front door hanging off its hinges, her peaceful home violated in seconds. 2 other officers moved past her, flashlights sweeping through her apartment like she was some kind of criminal suspect. Her mind raced through possibilities. Had something happened in the building? A break-in? A fire? But if this was an emergency, why were they treating her like a threat? She was the resident in her own home in her pajamas, for crying out loud. "What's your name?" the lead officer demanded. She could see his name tag now. Derek Paulson. She burned that name into her memory. Jasmine Carter. "I'm the owner of this unit." "What is this about?" "We received a noise complaint." "Loud disturbance coming from this unit." Jasmine's confusion mixed with anger. "A noise complaint?" "I was asleep. I've been home alone all evening, reading before bed." There was no noise. Derek walked further into her apartment, his flashlight beam moving across her walls. She'd decorated carefully when she moved in a year ago. Photos from college, her FBI Academy graduation, some artwork she'd picked up at a local gallery. Everything neat and organized the way she liked it, and then his flashlight stopped. The beam held steady on one particular spot on her wall, and Jasmine saw exactly what he was looking at. Her FBI jacket, the one she'd worn during training at Quantico, with the bright yellow letters across the back. She'd hung it there with pride, alongside her credentials and a photo of her graduating class. The change in the room was instant. Derek's swagger faltered. His flashlight stayed locked on that jacket for what felt like forever, but was probably only a few seconds. She heard one of the other officers mutter something under his breath. The third guy, younger than the others, actually took a step backward. "You're FBI?" Derek's voice had lost some of its edge, replaced by something that sounded like concern. Maybe even fear. Jasmine pushed herself up slowly, keeping her movements deliberate and visible. "Yes, Special Agent Jasmine Carter, and you just conducted an illegal entry into a federal agent's home. Now I'm going to stand up, walk to that table and get my credentials. Understood?" Nobody stopped her. She walked to her coffee table where she'd left her badge and ID after work. Her hands were steadier now, anger replacing the initial shock. She held up her credentials, the official seal catching the light from their flashlights. Derek's face had gone pale. His 2 partners looked at each other nervously. This had gone from a routine intimidation call to a potential federal incident in the span of about 30 seconds. "I need to see your authorization for forced entry," Jasmine said, her voice cold and professional now. This was the voice she used when interrogating suspects. "And I need your names, badge numbers, and your supervisor's contact information. All of it. Right now." Derek stammered something about HOA regulations and authority to ensure community safety. Corporate buzzwords that didn't mean anything in the face of actual law. Jasmine had studied constitutional law. She knew her rights backward and forward. HOA regulations don't override the Fourth Amendment, she told him flatly. You just violated my constitutional rights. You conducted an illegal search and seizure, so unless you have a warrant signed by a judge, which I'm guessing you don't, you need to start explaining yourself. The younger officer spoke up, his voice uncertain. We were told we had authority to enter any unit for safety violations or disturbances. Told by whom? Jasmine pressed. And what disturbance? I want to see the complaint. Who filed it? What time? What specific noise did they report? Derek pulled out a tablet, swiping through screens with fingers that weren't quite steady. Anonymous complaint called in at 1:53 a.m. Reported loud music and shouting from this unit. Jasmine looked at her phone again. 2:17 now, which meant they'd shown up less than 25 minutes after this supposed complaint. That was fast. Suspiciously fast. And the complaint itself was completely fabricated. She'd been sound asleep by 10 p.m. after a 14-hour shift at the office. I want a copy of that complaint, she said. And I'm documenting everything right now. She pulled out her phone and started recording. The officers tensed but didn't try to stop her. She filmed her splintered door. The damage to her doorframe got clear shots of all three officers' faces and name tags. Derek Paulson, Mike Torres, and the younger one was named Jason Webb. This is Agent Jasmine Carter, documenting an illegal entry into my residence at 2:17 a.m. on November 10th, she said clearly for the recording. 3 HOA security officers broke down my door without a warrant, without my consent, and without any legitimate emergency justification. She walked through her apartment with the camera, showing each room. Nothing disturbed. No party, no guests, no loud music. Just a woman who'd been sleeping in her own home, now dealing with 3 armed men who'd terrified her for no legitimate reason. Do you see any evidence of the disturbance you claim to respond to? She asked Derek directly, camera pointed at his face. Any party? Any noise? Any reason whatsoever that justified breaking into my home? He couldn't meet her eyes. We were following protocol. Whose protocol? Because it certainly isn't legal protocol. Give me your supervisor's contact information. Now. Derek pulled out a business card with shaking hands. The supervisor's name was listed as Gary Mitchell, Operations Manager for Prestige Community Services. Jasmine photographed the card and made a note of every detail. The officers left soon after, mumbling something about filing a report and having someone contact her about the door. Jasmine stood in her violated apartment, adrenaline still pumping through her system, staring at her broken door. She was an FBI agent. She had credentials, training, and the full weight of federal law behind her. That jacket hanging on her wall had probably saved her from much worse. But what if she'd been someone else? What if she'd been just another black woman without a badge? Would they have been more aggressive? Would things have escalated? The question haunted her as she wedged a chair against her broken door and tried to process what had just happened. She knew one thing for certain. This wasn't random. This wasn't a simple mistake. And she wasn't going to let it go. By the time the sun came up, Jasmine had already started making calls. Her supervisor needed to know what happened. But more than that, she needed to understand why it happened. Because something about this whole situation felt targeted, deliberate, and wrong in ways that went deeper than just a broken door. She looked at that FBI jacket one more time. It had identified her as someone with power, someone they couldn't just push around. But how many of her neighbors didn't have that protection? How many people in this building had experienced something similar and just accepted it because they didn't think they could fight back? Jasmine wasn't going to accept it, and she was going to find out exactly what was going on in her building, no matter where the investigation led. The room went completely silent. You could hear a pin drop. The lead security officer, Derek, stood frozen like someone had pressed pause on him. His eyes kept bouncing between Jasmine's FBI jacket hanging on the wall and Jasmine herself, still lying face down on her own living room floor. His partner took a small step backward, and you could see the panic starting to creep across his face. Jasmine wasn't panicking, though. Years of training kicked in, even though this time she was the one on the wrong end of everything. Her voice came out steady and cold as ice. I'm Special Agent Jasmine Carter with the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Now I'm going to stand up slowly and I'm going to get my credentials. Nobody move. She got up carefully, walked to her coffee table where she'd left her badge and ID that evening, and held them up. The official seal caught the light from their flashlights. Derek's face went from red to white in about 2 seconds flat. This wasn't just some random resident they could push around anymore. This was a federal agent, and they'd just broken into her home in the middle of the night without any legal justification. "Let me see your warrant," Jasmine said. Her hands weren't shaking anymore. Now she was in work mode. Derek stammered something about HOA regulations and community safety protocols. Big words that didn't mean anything. Jasmine knew exactly what was happening here. She'd seen it before in her cases, just never thought she'd be living it in her own home. "HOA regulations don't override the Fourth Amendment," she told them, her voice getting sharper. "You just conducted an illegal search and seizure. Now give me your names, badge numbers, and your supervisor's contact information. All of it, right now." As the officers fumbled to comply, Jasmine pulled out her phone and started documenting everything. She took photos of her splintered front door, hanging off its hinges. She recorded their names and badge numbers. She made them explain on camera exactly why they thought they had the right to break into her home at 2 a.m. The story kept changing. First it was a noise complaint. Then it was a welfare check. Then something about suspicious activity. None of it made sense because Jasmine had been home alone, reading a book before falling asleep. She hadn't made a sound louder than turning a page. After the officers finally left, promising someone would contact her about the door, Jasmine couldn't sleep. Her mind was racing. Something about this whole thing felt wrong. And not just the obvious violation of her rights. It felt targeted. It felt personal. And her investigator instincts were screaming at her that there was more to this story. She spent the rest of the night making calls. Her neighbors on the same floor were confused when she woke them up. But they answered her questions. Mrs. Chen from 2 doors down said she'd never had security even knock on her door. Despite hosting weekly mahjong games that sometimes went past midnight, the young couple across the hall admitted they'd thrown several parties with music loud enough to rattle the walls, and the most they'd ever gotten was a polite email asking them to keep it down. Then Jasmine learned something that made her blood boil. She was the only black woman living alone on her entire floor. In fact, she was one of only 3 black residents in the entire building of 48 units. The next morning, exhausted but determined, Jasmine went straight to the HOA management office. She filed a formal complaint and requested copies of all incident reports and entry authorizations for the past 2 years. The property manager, a nervous man who kept adjusting his glasses, tried to tell her that information was confidential. "Federal agent," Jasmine reminded him, tapping her badge on his desk, "and victim of what I suspect is a civil rights violation. You can give me the records voluntarily, or I can come back with a subpoena. Your choice." She got the records. What Jasmine found in those files kept her up for another 3 nights straight. Page after page of incident reports, and a pattern so clear it might as well have been written in neon lights. She created a spreadsheet, something she'd learned to do for case files. Unit numbers, resident demographics, incident types, and outcomes. The numbers told a story that made her sick. Units occupied by people of color had forced entries at 4 times the rate of units occupied by white residents. 4 times. And when she dug into the actual complaints, they fell apart like wet tissue paper. A software developer named Trevor had his door broken down because someone reported the smell of marijuana. He'd been cooking dinner. Indian food. Apparently, curry spices smell like drugs to some people. A nurse named Patricia got confronted by security at 3 a.m. for loitering in common areas. She was checking her mail after working a night shift at the hospital. A college professor named James was reported for suspicious activity because he sat in his car for 10 minutes talking on the phone before going inside. The white residents, their actual violations were barely documented. Loud parties got gentle warnings. Actual rule violations were handled with polite emails. Nobody's door got kicked in because they cooked ethnic food or checked their mail at odd hours. But it got worse. Jasmine started digging into the security company's background. Derek, the officer who led the raid on her apartment, had been fired from his previous job as a police officer in the next county over. Multiple complaints of racial profiling and excessive force. Somehow the HOA management company had hired him anyway. No questions asked. The management company itself, called Prestige Community Services, had an interesting history. They'd operated exclusively in wealthy, predominantly white neighborhoods for years. Only recently had they started managing properties in more diverse communities, and everywhere they went, complaints from minority residents followed. Jasmine found online reviews from other properties Prestige managed. The same stories over and over: aggressive security, selective enforcement, residents of color feeling harassed in their own homes. One review from a father in another state brought tears to her eyes. He described security officers following his teenage son from the parking lot to their unit, interrogating the boy about whether he really lived there, even though he was carrying groceries and had keys in his hand. She reached out to some of these other residents, making phone calls in the evening after work. Each conversation added another piece to the puzzle. These weren't isolated incidents or misunderstandings. This was systematic. This was intentional, and the more Jasmine learned, the angrier she became. One woman she spoke with, a lawyer named Diana, had actually moved out of her condo because the harassment got so bad. "I couldn't take it anymore," Diana said, her voice tired even over the phone. "I worked hard to afford that place, and they made me feel like a criminal every single day. My white neighbors didn't understand why I was so upset. They'd never experienced it," Jasmine understood. Before that night, she'd lived in her building for almost a year without major problems. Sure, she'd gotten a few odd looks in the elevator. Sure, delivery drivers sometimes seemed surprised she was the one who lived in her unit. But she'd chalked it up to isolated ignorance, not pattern and practice. Now she knew better. Now she had proof, and now she had a decision to make. She could file a civil lawsuit, take a settlement, and move on with her life. Or she could do what she'd sworn to do when she took her oath as a federal agent: protect the civil rights of all citizens, even when it meant investigating a system that had violated her own. Jasmine looked at her broken door, still waiting to be properly repaired despite promises from the HOA. She looked at her FBI jacket hanging on the wall, the one that had probably saved her from much worse that night. And she made her choice. This wasn't just about her anymore. This was about every person who'd been made to feel unsafe in their own home. Every parent who'd worried about their kids being harassed. Every hard-working person who'd been treated like a suspect instead of a resident. She picked up her phone and called her supervisor at the FBI. It was time to take this investigation federal. Jasmine's supervisor listened to everything without interrupting. When she finished explaining what happened and what she'd found in the HOA records, there was a long silence on the other end of the phone. Then he said 3 words that changed everything. Document everything officially. Within a week, Jasmine wasn't just a victim anymore. She was an investigator on her own case, with the full backing of the FBI's Civil Rights Division. But she kept her involvement quiet. She wanted to see how deep this rabbit hole went, and people talk more freely when they don't know a federal agent is listening. She started attending HOA board meetings. These happened once a month in the community clubhouse, and usually only about 5 or 6 people showed up. Mostly older residents who cared about things like landscaping budgets and pool maintenance schedules. Jasmine sat in the back taking notes while the board members droned on about routine business. But then came the section about security reports. The board president, a retired banker named Walter, would read through incident summaries without much comment. Jasmine noticed something interesting. When incidents involved units in certain buildings with more diverse residents, Walter would nod approvingly and praise the security team for being vigilant. When similar incidents happened in predominantly white buildings, he'd express concern about overly aggressive responses. The double standard was right there, playing out in real time, and nobody seemed to notice. Or maybe they noticed and just didn't care. After one meeting, Jasmine approached another resident who'd been sitting near the front, an elderly woman named Helen who'd lived in the community for 15 years. They struck up a conversation about property values and neighborhood safety, and Helen started talking freely. "It's not like it used to be," Helen said, shaking her head. "We used to know everyone in the building. Now there's all these new people moving in. Different types of people, you know." Jasmine knew exactly what she meant, even if Helen wouldn't say it directly. "Different how?" she asked, keeping her voice neutral. Helen lowered her voice like she was sharing a secret. "Well, I don't want to sound prejudiced, but the board has been worried about maintaining standards. That's why they brought in Prestige. They promised to keep things under control. Keep things under control." Such simple words that meant something so ugly. Jasmine dug deeper into Prestige Community Services. She used every database available to her as a federal agent, And what she found was damning. The company's president, a man named Richard Whitmore, had built his entire business model around managing HOAs in wealthy white neighborhoods. His marketing materials even bragged about preserving community, character, and protecting property values, which were basically code words for keeping certain people out. But the real estate market had shifted. Those wealthy white neighborhoods weren't growing anymore. If Prestige wanted to expand, they needed to move into diverse urban areas where the real growth was happening. And when they did, they brought their playbook with them. Jasmine found internal company emails through a federal subpoena. One email from Richard to his regional managers made her stomach turn. Increased security presence in urban properties ensures compliance with community standards and maintains the investment value for our primary stakeholders. It was written in careful corporate language, but the meaning was clear. Harass the diverse residents, make them uncomfortable, hope they leave. Another email discussed hiring practices for security officers. Prior law enforcement experience preferred, especially officers with tactical training. What they didn't say, but what Jasmine discovered, was that many of these officers had been pushed out of police departments for excessive force complaints or discriminatory behavior. Prestige was hiring people that police departments wouldn't keep, then giving them authority to enter people's homes. The paper trail was everywhere once you knew what to look for. Budget documents showed that buildings with higher percentages of minority residents received double the security staffing of comparable buildings with mostly white residents. Incident reports used different language depending on who was involved. A white resident playing loud music was having a gathering. A black resident playing music at the same volume was creating a disturbance. Jasmine started reaching out to residents from other Prestige-managed properties across 3 states. She'd find them through online reviews, neighborhood forums, and social media groups. Each conversation added another layer to the story. There was Vincent, a veteran who'd served 3 tours overseas. Security had pulled guns on him in the parking lot because someone reported a suspicious person looking into car windows. He'd been checking on his own truck because the alarm was going off. When he tried to explain, they demanded to see proof he lived there, even though he was wearing dog tags and standing right in front of his vehicle with his keys in hand. There was Keisha, a dental hygienist who'd saved for years to buy her condo. She got written up for having too many visitors when her family came over for Sunday dinner. Her white neighbor who hosted poker nights every week with 8 or 9 guys never received a single complaint. There was Robert, a high school teacher who got reported for drug activity because he sat on his balcony smoking a legal cigar. The security report described him as acting suspiciously and possibly under the influence. He'd been grading papers. The stories went on and on. Each one by itself might have been dismissed as a misunderstanding. But together they painted a picture of systematic harassment designed to make people of color feel unwelcome in their own homes. Jasmine compiled everything into a massive case file. Spreadsheets with demographic data and incident rates, copies of discriminatory emails, witness statements from dozens of residents, hiring records showing Prestige's pattern of employing officers with troubled backgrounds, financial documents proving the company allocated resources differently based on the racial makeup of buildings. She also discovered something that made the case even stronger. Prestige had been sued twice before in other states for Fair Housing Act violations. Both times they'd settled quietly with confidentiality agreements that kept the details private. Nobody knew about these previous cases because the victims had been paid to stay silent. That wasn't going to happen this time. The FBI's investigation expanded to include the Department of Justice. Attorneys who specialized in civil rights cases reviewed Jasmine's findings and confirmed what she already knew. This wasn't just contract security being overzealous. This was a coordinated effort to discriminate against protected classes of residents. But building a federal case takes time, and Jasmine had to keep living in her building while the investigation moved forward. Her door had been fixed, but the damage went deeper than splintered wood. She found herself tensing up every time she heard footsteps in the hallway. She'd wake up at the slightest sound, her hand instinctively reaching for her service weapon on the nightstand. Other residents started treating her differently too. Word had gotten around that she'd filed complaints against the HOA. Some people, mostly residents of color, would give her subtle nods of support in the elevator. Others, mostly white residents, avoided her entirely. One woman actually moved to the other side of the lobby when Jasmine walked in. The board sent her a letter threatening legal action for defaming the HOA and security company. Her lawyer, provided by the FBI, sent them a letter back that basically said, "Bring it on." They went quiet after that. Meanwhile, the investigation kept uncovering new evidence. Jasmine's case had opened the floodgates, and residents from prestige properties across multiple states were coming forward with their own stories. What started as one woman's nightmare at 2 in the morning had exposed a company-wide pattern of discrimination affecting thousands of people. Jasmine knew they had enough evidence to take this to court. The question now wasn't whether they'd win. The question was how big the consequences would be, and whether this case would change anything for all the people still living under Prestige's thumb. She looked at her FBI jacket every morning before heading to work. It had saved her that night by making those officers think twice. But what about all the people who didn't have a badge and credentials to protect them? This case had to be about them too. 6 months after that night, Jasmine sat in a conference room at FBI headquarters with 12 other agents, 3 Justice Department attorneys, and enough evidence to fill an entire wall. Charts showing incident patterns, financial records, email threads, witness statements. Everything was color-coded and cross-referenced like they were taking down an organized crime syndicate. In a way, they were. The lead attorney, a sharp woman named Catherine who'd spent 20 years prosecuting civil rights cases, tapped her pen on the table. "We've got them," she said simply. "The question is whether we go for a settlement or take this to trial." Jasmine didn't hesitate. "Trial. People need to see what happened." "If we settle quietly, nothing changes," Catherine smiled. "I was hoping you'd say that." But before they could move forward, something happened that changed the whole trajectory of the case. A reporter from the local news got wind of the investigation. Jasmine never found out who leaked it, but suddenly her story was everywhere. The news segment aired on a Tuesday evening. They showed footage of Jasmine's building, interviewed some of her neighbors, and displayed some of the statistics her investigation had uncovered. The reporter, a young journalist named Kevin, didn't sensationalize it. He just presented the facts, and the facts were damning enough on their own. By Wednesday morning, the story had gone national. Cable news picked it up. Social media exploded. Hashtags started trending. Jasmine's name and face were suddenly everywhere, which was the last thing an FBI agent usually wants. Her phone wouldn't stop ringing. News outlets wanted interviews. Civil rights organizations wanted her to speak at events. Other residents from other prestige properties were reaching out with their own stories, emboldened by seeing someone finally fight back. But not everyone was supportive. Jasmine started getting hate mail, anonymous letters calling her a troublemaker, claiming she was playing the race card, telling her to move if she didn't like the rules. Someone spray-painted her parking space with a slur that made her cry when she saw it. The building security cameras, ironically, had been malfunctioning that night. The threats got serious enough that the FBI assigned her protection. 2 agents she'd worked with on previous cases became her shadows, following her to and from work, checking her apartment before she entered. It was surreal, being protected by her own colleagues because she dared to demand her constitutional rights. The HOA board held an emergency meeting. Jasmine attended, along with about 60 other residents and half a dozen news cameras. The tiny community clubhouse was packed beyond capacity, with people standing in the hallway trying to hear what was happening inside. Walter, the board president, looked like he'd aged 10 years in the past week. He read from a prepared statement, his hands shaking slightly. "The board takes these allegations very seriously. We've launched an internal review of our security protocols, and we're committed to ensuring all residents feel safe and welcome." Someone in the crowd shouted, "Too late for that." The meeting devolved into chaos. Residents who'd experienced similar treatment stood up and shared their stories. Others defended the HOA, insisting the security measures were necessary and that Jasmine was overreacting. The divide in the community was stark and ugly. Neighbors who'd smiled at each other in the elevator for years were now on opposite sides of a battle line. One moment stood out to Jasmine. A white woman named Patricia, who lived on the 3rd floor, stood up with tears in her eyes. "I didn't know," she said, her voice breaking. "I've lived here for 8 years and I had no idea this was happening to my neighbors." I'm ashamed that I never noticed. I'm ashamed that I benefited from a system that treated other people like criminals." The room went quiet. Patricia sat down, and several other white residents nodded in agreement. Not everyone, but enough to matter. Meanwhile, the legal pressure on Prestige was mounting. The Justice Department filed a formal lawsuit alleging systematic violations of the Fair Housing Act. The case covered not just Jasmine's building, but 47 properties across 5 states. Thousands of residents were potentially affected. The evidence kept growing. More internal emails surfaced through discovery, including some that were even worse than what Jasmine had initially found. In one email chain, Richard Whitmore, the company president, discussed specific buildings where they wanted to encourage turnover among urban demographic residents. He literally wrote that. His lawyers probably had a heart attack when they saw it. Security officers started flipping too. One guard, a younger guy named Tommy who'd only been with Prestige for 6 months, reached out to Jasmine's attorneys. He'd been uncomfortable with the company's practices from the beginning but needed the job. Now he was willing to testify about the discriminatory orders he'd received from supervisors. According to Tommy, there were unofficial quotas. Buildings with diverse populations were expected to generate a certain number of incident reports per month. If numbers were low, supervisors would pressure officers to be more proactive. That was their word for it. Proactive. As if terrorizing residents at 2 a.m. was somehow a positive thing. Derek, the officer who'd kicked in Jasmine's door, tried to save himself by cooperating with investigators. He claimed he'd just been following orders, that he didn't know breaking into someone's home without a warrant was illegal. His lawyer made him sound like a victim of poor training rather than someone who'd abused his authority for years. Jasmine didn't buy it for a second. Derek had been a cop before. He knew exactly what he was doing. The case started attracting attention from lawmakers, too. A state senator named Mitchell introduced legislation to regulate HOA enforcement practices and require background checks for security personnel. He invited Jasmine to testify at a committee hearing. She'd testified in court before, but this was different. The hearing room was packed with cameras, reporters, and residents from HOAs across the state. Jasmine wore her FBI credentials visible on her jacket, a deliberate choice. She wanted everyone to remember that this wasn't just about her being upset. This was a federal agent, someone trained to investigate crimes, telling them that crimes had been committed. Her testimony was straightforward. She described that night in detail, the splintered door, the guns pointed at her, the fear she'd felt lying on her own floor. Then she presented the data, the patterns, the evidence of discrimination that couldn't be explained away as coincidence or misunderstanding. "This isn't about HOAs having rules," she said clearly. "This is about those rules being enforced differently depending on the color of someone's skin. That's not just unfair, it's illegal. And it's happening in communities across this state, across this country." The committee members asked questions for over 2 hours. Some were genuinely curious and concerned. Others seemed more interested in defending property rights and HOA authority. One senator tried to suggest that maybe the minority residents were actually violating rules more often. Jasmine fixed him with the same look she gave suspects during interrogations. "Senator, with all due respect, the data doesn't support that. What the data shows is selective enforcement of rules that everyone breaks. When a white resident plays loud music, it's a friendly reminder. When a black resident plays music at the same volume, it's a forced entry at 2 a.m. That's not about rules. That's about racism." The room went silent. The clip went viral by that evening. Prestige's stock price, they were a publicly traded company, dropped 17% in a week. Major real estate investment firms started pulling their business. HOA boards across the country were terminating their contracts with Prestige and scrambling to distance themselves from the scandal. Richard Whitmore resigned, though he claimed it was for personal reasons, and not because his company was collapsing around him. His resignation letter made no mention of the discrimination, the lawsuits, or the residents whose lives his policies had damaged. But resignation wasn't going to be enough. The Justice Department was pursuing criminal charges against several Prestige executives and security officers, including Derek, for civil rights violations. If convicted, they could face years in federal prison. Jasmine watched it all unfold with mixed emotions. Part of her felt vindicated. satisfied that the system was finally working the way it was supposed to. But another part of her felt exhausted and frustrated. Why did it take an FBI agent getting victimized for people to pay attention? How many residents had suffered in silence before her because they didn't have a badge to protect them? The answer to that question kept her up at night, even more than the memory of that broken door. The courtroom was packed on the day of the settlement announcement. Jasmine sat in the front row, flanked by her attorneys and several other residents who'd joined the lawsuit. She'd worn her best suit, the one she usually saved for testifying in major cases. Today felt just as important as any case she'd ever worked on. The judge, a no-nonsense woman named Barbara Chen who'd been on the bench for 23 years, reviewed the settlement terms carefully before speaking. This court finds the proposed settlement to be fair, reasonable, and in the public interest, she said. Then she looked directly at the Prestige attorneys. Though I'll note that the evidence presented in this case is among the most troubling I've seen in my career. The numbers were staggering. Prestige Community Services agreed to pay $4.7 million in damages to affected residents. Jasmine would receive a significant portion, but she'd already decided to donate most of it to civil rights organizations working on housing discrimination. Money couldn't fix what happened, but maybe it could prevent it from happening to someone else. But the financial settlement was only part of it. The real victory was in the reforms. Prestige had to implement mandatory bias training for every single employee, from security guards to corporate executives. They had to establish clear protocols for property entry that actually respected constitutional rights. No more kicking in doors based on anonymous noise complaints. No more harassment disguised as security. The company would be monitored by federal observers for 5 years. Every incident report, every security action, every policy decision would be reviewed to ensure compliance. If they slipped back into their old ways, the penalties would be severe. Richard Whitmore, the former company president, didn't attend the hearing. He was dealing with his own legal problems. Criminal charges had been filed against him, and 3 other executives for conspiracy to violate civil rights. Their trial was scheduled for the following year, and Jasmine was already preparing to testify. Derek, the security officer who'd broken into her home, took a plea deal. He pleaded guilty to violating Jasmine's Fourth Amendment rights and received 2 years in federal prison, plus 3 years of supervised release. It wasn't as much as Jasmine would have liked, but it was more than many victims of police misconduct ever got. 2 other officers who'd participated in similar incidents at different properties also faced charges. The message was clear. You can't hide behind a security uniform when you violate someone's constitutional rights. After the hearing, Jasmine stood on the courthouse steps surrounded by reporters and cameras. She'd gotten used to the media attention over the past several months, though it still felt strange being on this side of an investigation. This case was never just about me, she told the crowd of journalists. It was about every person who's been made to feel like a criminal in their own home. Every parent who's had to explain to their kids why security follows them, but not their white neighbors. Every hardworking person who saved up to buy a place, only to be harassed for existing in it. Someone asked if she planned to continue living in her building. She'd thought about that question a lot lately. I'm staying, she said firmly. This is my home. I'm not letting anyone push me out of it. The building had changed dramatically in the months since the lawsuit became public. The old HOA board had been dissolved entirely. New elections were held with federal oversight, and the new board looked different. It was diverse, younger, and actually representative of the people who lived there. Their first official action was terminating the contract with Prestige and hiring a new security company, one that actually trained their officers in civil rights and de-escalation. The new guards were professional, respectful, and understood that their job was to help residents, not intimidate them. The community itself was healing, though it was a slow process. Those ugly divisions that had emerged during the crisis didn't disappear overnight, but something had shifted. People were talking to each other now, really talking, about race and privilege and fairness in ways they'd never discussed before. Patricia, the white resident who'd spoken up at that chaotic board meeting, had become an unlikely ally. She'd organized a community dialogue series where residents could share their experiences and learn from each other. Not everyone participated, and some of the conversations got uncomfortable, but it was a start. Jasmine attended one of these sessions. She listened as Vincent, the veteran who'd had guns pulled on him in the parking lot, described what that moment had felt like. She watched white residents squirm with discomfort, then saw some of them genuinely try to understand. "I served my country," Vincent said, his voice steady but his eyes wet. "I put my life on the line overseas, and I came home to this, to being treated like a threat in my own neighborhood." An older white man named Gregory raised his hand. "I didn't know," he said quietly. "I've called security before for minor things, and they always handled it so professionally with me. I never thought about whether they treated everyone the same way. I'm sorry I didn't pay attention." Small moments like that gave Jasmine hope. Real change didn't happen in courtrooms alone. It happened in conversations between neighbors, in people choosing to see each other's humanity. The case had opened floodgates across the country. Residents from other HOAs started investigating their own communities, requesting incident reports looking for patterns. Several other major lawsuits were filed against different management companies. Jasmine's case had become a blueprint for holding these organizations accountable. She started getting invited to speak at conferences, law schools, and civil rights organizations. She talked about what happened, but more importantly, she talked about what people could do. How to document discrimination. How to organize with neighbors. How to file complaints with HUD and the Justice Department. She armed people with knowledge because knowledge was power. One evening, about a year after that terrible night, Jasmine sat in her living room looking at her FBI jacket still hanging on the wall. The jacket that had probably saved her life, or at least saved her from worse treatment that night. Next to it now hung a framed letter from the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, thanking her for her courage and advocacy. There was also a photo from the settlement hearing, showing her surrounded by other residents who'd found their voices through her case. Her doorbell rang. When she opened it, a young black woman stood there nervously holding a folder. "Agent Carter, I'm Tanya. I live in the building across town. I saw your case on the news and I think the same thing is happening at my HOA. Can you help me?" Jasmine smiled and invited her in. This was the real victory, she realized. Not the settlement money or the criminal charges or even the policy changes. It was this. People knowing they didn't have to suffer in silence anymore. People understanding that they had rights and could fight for them. She spent 2 hours with Tanya, going through her documentation, explaining what evidence to gather, connecting her with attorneys who could help. When Tanya left, she looked different, stronger, more hopeful. Jasmine's phone buzzed with a text from her supervisor. Another case needed her attention, something about mortgage discrimination in a different county. The work never stopped, but she was ready for it. She walked back to her living room and stood in front of that FBI jacket one more time. She'd earned it by working hard, studying hard, proving herself over and over again. But she'd earned something else, too. She'd earned the respect of her community by standing up when it mattered most. By refusing to let fear or intimidation silence her. By turning her worst night into a catalyst for change. The door she'd replaced was solid now, with better locks and a reinforced frame. But she'd learned that real security didn't come from locks or doors or even federal credentials. It came from communities that chose fairness over fear, from neighbors who stood up for each other, and from people brave enough to fight systems that treated them as less than human. Her building wasn't perfect. The country wasn't perfect, but they were better than they'd been before. And tomorrow she'd wake up and work to make them better still. That was enough. That had to be enough. Jasmine turned off the lights and headed to her bedroom, sleeping peacefully for the first time in over a year. The nightmare that started at 2 a.m. had finally ended. But the work of building a more just world was just beginning, and she was ready for it.